30 years of gardening teaches you things that no book ever will. It teaches you what a plant looks like when it has decided your yard belongs to it. It teaches you the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting the same root system for the 4th consecutive summer. It teaches you the difference between a plant that rewards your care and a plant that exploits your enthusiasm, spreads into your neighbor's property, tears apart your fence, or quietly destroys everything growing around it while looking perfectly beautiful from 10 feet away. I have 30 years of that education behind me, and I want to be completely honest with you today about what it cost me to get it. Every plant on this list was something I planted willingly. Some of them I was excited about. Some I planted based on a recommendation from someone I trusted. Some I chose myself after reading a description that sounded like exactly what I needed for a difficult spot in the yard. Every single one of them eventually cost me more in time, money, and physical labor than the original planting was ever worth. And not one of them came with a label that told me what was actually coming. Your local garden center is not going to tell you what I am about to tell you. That is not cynicism. It is a structural reality. The business model of retail gardening depends on the repeat customer. The customer who buys something, watches it fail or run wild, and comes back next season to try something else is a more reliable revenue source than the customer who makes one right decision and stops needing to replace things. The information I am giving you today is the information that was never on the tag, never in the brochure, and never mentioned by the person who handed you a trowel and pointed you toward the checkout lane. I want you to drop your state or your USDA hardiness zone in the comments before you read any further. Just type it. I look at those comments every week, and they shape the content I put out because gardening advice that ignores where you actually live is not advice. It is decoration. Type your zone now, and let's get into the list. Plant 1 I ripped out was butterfly bush, Buttle-G Davidi, and I planted it for the single most understandable reason a gardener can have: the pollinators. The first summer it bloomed, I stood at my kitchen window watching a continuous procession of butterflies work those long purple flower cones from morning until the light failed in the evening. I thought I had done something genuinely good for the ecosystem in my yard. I had not. What I had done was plant one of the most ecologically deceptive plants sold in the American garden market. Here's what the pollinator label leaves out. Butterfly bush is a nectary, not a host plant. It produces nectar that adult butterflies drink, but it provides absolutely nothing for butterfly larvae. No native caterpillar species uses it as a food source. The butterflies that visit it are being drawn away from the native plants where they would lay eggs and support the next generation of their population, drawn to a sugar source that feeds them and ends the reproductive cycle right there. Ecologists have a term for this: an ecological trap, a resource that appears beneficial but reduces the long-term survival of the species it attracts. Beyond the ecological problem, butterfly bush is a prodigious self-seeder that has naturalized across roadsides, riverbanks, and disturbed land in over 30 American states. Each mature plant produces up to 3 million seeds per season. They are lightweight, and they travel on wind and water to establish in natural areas far beyond your garden fence. It is listed as invasive in Oregon, Washington, and several mid-Atlantic states, and the designation is spreading as the naturalized populations expand. What I planted instead was a combination of native Joe Pye weed, Eutrochium purpureum, and native ironweed, Vernonia noveboracensis. Both bloom in late summer in the same general purple color range. Both are genuine host plants for multiple native butterfly and moth species. The Joe Pye weed alone supports over 40 species of native bees. The ironweed is one of the most important late-season nectar sources in the eastern United States for migrating monarchs. My yard still fills with butterflies every summer. The difference is that now those butterflies are completing their full reproductive cycle in my yard, rather than being drawn away from the plants where they belong. Both are perennial, both are fully hardy in zones 4 through 9, and neither of them produces a seed that is going to establish in a riverbank 3 miles from my property. Plant 2 I ripped out was lemon balm, Melissa officinalis, which I planted in a kitchen herb bed with the best of intentions, and spent 4 years regretting at increasing intensity. Lemon balm self-seeds with the kind of casual aggression that seems almost personal after a while. It does not spread through underground runners the way mint does, which makes it sound more manageable. But the seed production is so prolific and the germination rate so high that by the second season, it was the dominant plant in a raised bed that had been intended for 6 different herbs. Every time I pulled a plant before it set seed, I missed enough flowers that hundreds of new plants came up the following spring. Every time I pulled a plant after it set seed, I had already lost that round. The smell when you disturb it is genuinely pleasant, which is part of what makes removing it so frustrating. You are standing there in the heat, pulling what smells like a lovely plant out of soil it has completely commandeered, and the pleasantness of the fragrance feels like an insult. What I planted in that bed instead was lemon thyme, Thymus citriodorus, which delivers the same lemon-forward fragrance in the kitchen, spread slowly and politely through low woody growth that stays exactly where it is placed, and has never once threatened to take over anything in 30 years of growing it. It is perennial in zones 5 through 9, drought-tolerant once established, and if a plant can be described as a good neighbor, lemon thyme is that plant. Plant 3 I ripped out was variegated goutweed, Egopodium podagraria variegatum, and I want to spend a moment on this one because it is sold with a confidence and cheerfulness at garden centers that should constitute some kind of formal complaint. Variegated goutweed is presented as a beautiful, low-maintenance ground cover for difficult shaded areas. The green and white variegated foliage is genuinely attractive, and it does exactly what the label promises in terms of covering ground quickly. What the label omits is that covering ground quickly is the entire personality of this plant, and it applies that personality without any respect for boundaries, desired limitations, or the survival of everything else growing nearby. Rhizomes are brittle and extensive, and goutweed regenerates from fragments so small you cannot reliably find them all when digging. I planted it in a shaded strip between my fence and a garden bed, thinking I had found the solution to a space where nothing else would grow. Within 3 seasons, it had crossed into the garden bed and was emerging among the roots of established perennials I had been growing for a decade. Getting it out of an established perennial planting without destroying the perennials is one of the most tedious garden tasks I have ever performed, and I had to do it across multiple seasons because I kept missing root fragments that regrew the following year. What I planted instead was native wild ginger, Asarum canadense for the deep shade sections, and Pennsylvania sedge, Carex pennsylvanica, for the areas with a little more light. Wild ginger spreads slowly and politely, forms a dense, attractive ground cover, and supports native insects in ways that goutweed, a European import, never will. Pennsylvania sedge forms tidy, low-growing tufts that knit together over time into a fine-textured ground cover that tolerates dry shade conditions that defeat almost every other plant. Neither of them has ever given me a single moment of the specific frustration that goutweed generated across 4 years of attempted coexistence. Plant 4 I ripped out was purple leucostrife, Lythrum salicaria, and I want to be direct with you about something before I go any further into this one. If you currently have purple loosestrife in your yard, I am not here to make you feel bad about it. It is an extraordinarily beautiful plant, and the people who sold it understood that beauty translates directly into sales. The tall, magenta-purple flower spikes that bloom in midsummer are among the most visually striking things a garden can produce. I understand completely why it was planted in millions of American yards across the second half of the 20th century. I planted it for exactly that reason, and I kept it for 3 summers, because looking at it in bloom made it very hard to justify the work of removing it. But purple loose strife does not stay in your yard. It was introduced to North American wetlands in the early 1800s and has since become one of the most ecologically destructive invasive plants on the continent. A single mature plant produces up to 2.5 million seeds per season. Those seeds travel by water, by wind, and on the boots of anyone who walks through a wetland where it has established. It has colonized millions of acres of North American wetland habitat, displacing the native cattails, bulrushes, and sedges that waterfowl and wetland wildlife depend on for food and nesting cover. In many states, it is not just discouraged, it is illegal to plant, sell, or transport. The ecological cost of its ornamental appeal has been measured in the destruction of wetland ecosystems across an entire continent. What I planted instead was native blazing star, Liatris spicata, which blooms in the same general magenta-purple color range at approximately the same midsummer timing and provides what purple loose strife never could, genuine ecological value to the native ecosystem. Liatris is a major nectar source for migrating monarchs and a host plant for several native moth species. It grows in a well-behaved, upright clump that stays exactly where it is planted, produces no invasive seed dispersal, and comes back reliably every year in zones 3 through 9 with no intervention required. The visual effect in a garden is comparable. The ecological effect is the complete opposite. Plant 5 I ripped out was bishop's weed in its non-variegated form. It is a close relative of the goutweed I described earlier, and the story is similar enough that I will keep this one brief, because the mechanism of damage is the same, and the lesson was learned the same painful way. What is worth adding is the specific financial cost, which I tracked across the 3 seasons it took me to fully remove it from a 40-foot border. Between the labor hours I put in myself, which I valued at a modest rate, and one season when I hired help because my own back made the digging impossible, removing a plant I had paid $12 for at a garden center cost me just under $400 to undo. That number sat with me for a long time. What I planted instead was a combination of native coral bells, Heuchera americana, and native foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia. Both thrive in the partial shade where bishop's weed had been. Both support native insects, and neither has ever cost me a single dollar beyond the original purchase price to maintain. Part 2 continues with the remaining 4 plants, the specific removal strategies that actually work for each one, and the single most important question you should ask at a garden center before any plant goes into your cart. Plant 6 I ripped out was Rose of Sharon, Hibiscus syriacus, and this one is going to surprise some of you because it is genuinely beautiful and genuinely beloved, and has been growing in American cottage gardens for so long that removing it feels almost disrespectful to tradition. The problem is not the plant itself in isolation. The problem is the seed production, which is extraordinary in quantity and in germination rate. A mature Rose of Sharon produces thousands of seeds per season, and they germinate at a rate that makes spring weeding in any bed within 40 feet of the plant a significant annual commitment. I spent 6 years pulling Rose of Sharon seedlings from every crack, every border, every gravel path, and every established bed within range of the 2 plants I had growing along my back fence. The plants themselves were beautiful. Everything surrounding them was a management problem. What I planted instead was native rose mallow, Hibiscus mosquitos, which produces flowers considerably larger than Rose of Sharon, in colors ranging from white through pink to deep burgundy red, blooms from midsummer through early autumn, and sets seed in quantities that are manageable rather than overwhelming. It dies back completely to the ground each winter and returns reliably in zones 4 through 9. It is a genuine native plant that supports native bees and several specialist moth species. And it has never produced a single volunteer seedling in a location where I did not want one. Plant number 7 I ripped out was Sweet Autumn Clematis, Clematis terniflora, for exactly the same reason. Beautiful, fragrant, covered in white flowers in late summer, and producing seed in volumes that guarantee it will appear in every bed, every fence line, and every shrub within dispersal range the following spring. Listed as invasive in multiple states. Replaced with native Virgin's Bower, Clematis virginiana, which blooms similarly, supports native bees specifically, and behaves itself in a way its imported cousin never once did in my yard. Plant 8 I ripped out was Norwegian maple, Acer platanoides. It was a street tree I inherited when I bought the property, and I kept it for 11 years before the combination of surface root damage to my driveway and the aggressive seedling production in every bed finally made the removal decision straightforward. I replaced it with a native serviceberry, Amelanchier canadensis, which provides spring flowers, early summer fruit for birds, brilliant autumn color, and supports over 100 species of native caterpillars, compared to the 0 that the Norwegian maple supported in 30 years on my property. Plant 9 I ripped out was English lavender in a climate zone where it was never truly hardy, Zone 5, replacing it every 2 or 3 years after brutal winters killed it back past recovery. Replaced with native wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, which is fully perennial in zones 3 through 9, blooms in a similar soft purple color range, requires no replacement ever, and turns my yard into a hummingbird and native bee destination from midsummer through early autumn without a single dollar spent on replanting. Now, here's the one question I want you to ask at every garden center before anything goes into your cart. Ask whether the plant is native to your region or introduced, and ask specifically whether it has any invasive designation in your state. The person behind the counter may not know the answer. That uncertainty itself is information. Pull out your phone and look it up before you buy. The 3 seconds that takes has saved me more money and more frustration than any other single habit I have developed in 30 years of making exactly the mistakes I described today. Drop your zone in the comments. Tell me which plant on this list you have already ripped out, or which one you are now reconsidering. That conversation in the comments is worth more to the next gardener reading it than anything I could add.